Hey readers/listeners, Casella here. As usual, before we get going, a quick reminder that your support would be immensely appreciated. If you like what we're doing, please check out our Patreon and leave us a rating or review. That's it. That's all I'm going to say. Let's get into this one. A critic is a creature who has views quite like a camel's. Flowers and fruit he scorns. In the flower garden of the honeyed muse he starves unless he finds a meal of thorns. Hello, and welcome to A Meal of Thorns, a critical book club from the Ancillary Review of Books. I'm Jake Casilla Brookins. Every episode, we ask scholars, critics, writers, and fans to join us to talk about works of mostly speculative fiction, digging into what they're saying and why, maybe how, why they've stuck with us, what they say to or about the field. Today we're trying something a little different. We'll see how it goes. We are discussing two books, putting Robert A. Heinlein's The Moon is a Harsh Mistress in conversation with Annalee Newitz's The Terraformers. And this doubleheader was suggested by today's guest, Christian P. Haines. Christian is a professor of English at Penn State University. His critical work has appeared in Strange Horizons, the Ancillary Review of Books, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and more. He's the author of A Desire Called America, Biopolitics, Utopia, and the Literary Commons, and he's an editor and contributor for the Gamers with Glasses magazine and podcast. Christian, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for bringing me on.
Yeah, this was great. We'll get more into why you suggested these two, and I immediately jumped on it. But before we get into that, I was just curious if there's anything else you have been reading or working on you wanted to share.
Oh, sure. I've been reading too many things at once, as is my want. But I will say that I'm teaching a Stephen King course right now for the 50th year anniversary of Carrie. So we just wrapped up Carrie and started The Shining, and not unlike my experience with the Heinlein, The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. I haven't read The Shining in maybe 30 years, something like that. It's one of those books I read when I was probably 12.
Yep.
And so I'm coming back to it. I'm like, okay, this more or less holds up in the way that Stephen King novels more or less hold up.
Yeah.
Stephen King novels, especially some of the earlier ones, have pretty long wind-ups, So Carrie, takes about 100 or so pages before it gets to anything sort of like a kind of explosive supernatural event. And then, The Shining is sort of working that way as well. And so it's nice to go back. It's nice to see somebody's earlier work and, kind of have a chance to teach a little bit about where it came from and how it got produced and things like that. So
Yeah, that's very cool. That's awesome.
What about you? What are you reading these days?
Yeah, way too much as usual. I've got like a stack of reviews I got to finish up. I'm just reading right now, not for review. Someone had recommended it to me and I picked it up a while ago, is Raphael Bernal's His Name Was Death, which is this 1970s, he's a Mexican novelist. It's great. I'm only about halfway into it, but it's this very misanthropic eco-fiction, this guy who learns how to communicate with mosquitoes, and it turns out that they're sort of like an alien intelligence. I wish I would have read it a month ago when I was reading Michelle Nieva's Dengue Boy, which is, I don't know if it's out yet. It's coming out here soon.
No, there's a lot of good things coming out over the next month or so. I'm in the middle of this novel, When We Were Real, by Daryl Gregory, which sort of does the whole Matrix thing, except everybody knows that they're living in a simulation and can't really do much about it. And it takes the form of a road trip from one sort of glitch in North America to another glitch. And so there's this kind of comedic bent sort of kind of early 20th century existential fiction meets the Matrix sort of deal, but with actually funny sentences, and it's hard to do humor, I think, in speculative fiction. So it's pretty impressive in that regards. And
yeah, Gregory's kind of a rare gem that way. Comedy being your target with big science fiction concepts is not easy to do.
No, one of the reviews I did last year was for Adrian Tchaikovsky's Service Model, and it turned out to be maybe the one novel by Tchaikovsky I don't actually like because I don't think the humor really could work over 500 pages.
I am with you. I hate to say it, but yeah, I'm with you on that one. It's like an interesting novel, but if the kind of Pratchett-y, Adams-y thing doesn't work for you immediately and the whole way through, it's kind of, yeah.
Happy to always be, reading new speculative fiction coming out, and so it's, I think it's going to be a good year for that, so.
Ooh, if I would have thought about it, we could have used Service Model's sentient doors as a segue into.
Oh, that's a good point.
Okay. We'll try to put that away. We'll try to remember that connection. But let's hop into these because we've got a bunch. We've got two big books to get through. So I'm gonna briefly summarize both of these, and we'll kind of hop into them. I imagine we'll kind of start out talking about one and then the other, and kind of put them together. So Robert A. Heinlein's *The Moon is a Harsh Mistress* was published in 1966 by Putnam. Although it originally started as a serial the year before, it is set in the year 2075. It's about a revolution on the moon. Originally established as a penal colony, the lunar population has developed its own culture and desire for independence. And then a small group of revolutionaries, aided immensely by an emergent artificial intelligence, schemed to establish a free Luna. So this novel won the Hugo Award, and it's one of Heinlein's most influential works. For context for folks, if you're not familiar with Heinlein, probably fair to say that he is one of the most influential figures in the last century or so of science fiction. We'll talk more about him and that. But we're also going to be talking about the Terraformers, which is jumping almost 60 years ahead in real time and around 60,000, I think, years or so in fictional time. So this is Annalee Newitz's third novel, I believe, published by Tor in 2023, so not that long ago. It is set on a distant planet that has been terraformed to Earth-like conditions, and then the novel, in 3 separate sections, explores the lives of various workers as they develop biomes, cities, infrastructure, and struggle with corporate oppression. People in this world are genetically engineered, they can live for centuries, and they include non-human and non-biological forms such as robots and talking flying moose. Annalee Newitz is an influential figure in the field today. In addition to writing fiction and nonfiction books, they are a journalist and editor. They're the original founder of IO9, and they're the co-host of the award-winning podcast Our Opinions Are Correct. So those are the 2 books. I was trying to think of a fun, cute name for the episode, and I think now I'm leaning towards the TERRA is a former mistress. I think that's what I'm going to go for. But
I like it.
Before we dive into this, I also want to call out for the audience that, at least for my part, I'm going to be fairly harsh on both of these books in a few different ways. So if you really like them and you don't want to hear negativity from some dude on a podcast, this is a good point to tune out. But tell me, Christian, so we'd been talking about you hopping on the podcast, and we talked about a few different ideas. And then you threw out this idea of doing The Moon is a Harsh Mistress and the Terraformers together. And my brain just kind of immediately went like, yes, there's something there. And I just said yes. I want you to tell me what you were thinking about putting these 2 together.
So the very boring version one first is that I'm writing a book that has a chapter on terraforming in it at the moment. Cool. And just sort of reading not only the research, but also just kind of working my way through some of the gaps in my knowledge in fiction and realizing that, The Moon is a Harsh Mistress is often cited in that, that scholarship, but I haven't read it since I was like 12 or something. It was one of those early, I had like a lot of, sort of young boys, I had that kind of Heinlein phase, where I went through Starship Troopers, only barely understanding that it had a satirical element to it. The film, I think, drove that home for me almost better. Hadn't really thought about Heinlein's work in a long time. And then I read Annalee Newitz's The Terraformers, which I think I read early because I reviewed it for the LA Review of Books. And I'd always been interested in Newitz's fiction since they published Autonomous, and I'd been, IO9. I'd kind of haunted the sort of early days of the website. I was often reading it. And so, I always read whatever Newitz puts out. And in reading this, I think the thing that a lot of people, because I've talked to a lot of people that don't like this novel, I like it, but I understand people's reservations. It's a kind of wonky novel at the level of the sentence. There's a kind of strange humor to it that kind of harks back to the Heinlein, both in the sense of, making up words that sound futuristic only in the sense that they just sound off, the emphasis on non-human sentience and things like that. And so I knew there was something there. And the last thing I'll say is they're both novels very directly about revolution and about the kind of historical rhythms of revolution and of whether or not insurrection works. And I'm also been thinking a lot about that and writing a lot about that for our own contemporary historical moment. So I give a talk in a couple of weeks on the concept of insurrection, and I'm looking at like Lenin's writings, Vladimir Lenin's writings, among others. And so I've been thinking a lot about that, and actually rereading the Heinlein, I was like, oh yeah, this is a novel that's directly about revolution in a kind of nitty-gritty way that you don't see very often.
And it's interesting the models that it takes for revolution and how it thinks and talks about it. So much of the novel, the characters are sort of surface Russian coded, right? And like sort of one of the first things to get over in the book is Heinlein's like bad Russian accent, basically. I was hearing it in like a minor Russian character from the cartoon Archer kind of voice. So it's a writer who is heavily associated with America and like fairly far right ideas. I mean, plenty of people call him crypto-fascist. I don't know if that's quite it, but he embraces a lot of like very, very America central, fairly right, fairly militaristic views. And he has, during the Cold War, has written a novel about people of color who are Russian bombing America from space, and it's like, it kind of feels like, like, hey, Lyndon, are you reading this? Like, it's important to get to the moon first. But they're also the heroes. They're the protagonists, right? And the Americans, or the North Americans in the book, are sort of fairly obviously the villains. So it is strange. I should say, reading this again, I haven't read this in quite a long time. I think it's probably fair to say that Heinlein was the person who made me realize that there was a thing called science fiction and that I wanted to read more of it when I was a kid, because I'd read a lot of fantasy and stuff, but my elementary library had the Heinlein juveniles, like Farmer in the Sky and the Rolling Stones and all those, and I really ate them up and started looking for more, and that was kind of my way in. But coming back and reading this, on the one hand, I was flabbergasted by how offended I was at a lot of it. Most, like, the upfront stuff is the sexist stuff, but the deeper, like, libertarian crank ideas here, I was just like...
And let's not forget the blackface.
Let's not forget all the blackface. Let's not forget all the racial slurs and stereotypes. So on the one hand, that was sort of my first thing. But then I was thinking about, like, does this have a satirical level to it? And it's hard to figure out. And I think we'll talk about this maybe when we talk about Newitz, is that on the one hand, I feel bad assuming that it's just Heinlein talking straight to us, right? Because I want to believe that there's like this like authorial distance, right? But on the other hand, Heinlein is a person who sort of self-inserts and preaches a lot in his books. And this book's by the numbers, there's some action sequences. It's mostly talking heads. It's mostly like 3 people sit at a table for 5 chapters and say all their ideas. And so it's hard to separate what is him actually like trying to express this idea of, rational anarchism and the various kinds of revolution and freedom he talks about. But then you step back and you're like, I don't know, maybe there is a satirical level here. It's hard to say.
No, it's definitely, you get the sense of somebody who's been reading, those kind of early Cold War histories of the Soviet Union and who has maybe more sympathy for the project than you would expect on the one hand, and on the other hand, absolutely rejects it because the utopia of this novel, right? It's like Utopian Horizon, what it's aiming towards, is like a truly free market, right? And so there's this way in which you get like the kind of like early neoliberal discourse of the Milton Friedmans, the folks that would, go on to ruin Chile.
Oh, yeah.
That sort of 1973 revolution. And it really is like the competitive individual. We need to, to man up. And we have, of course, a character who goes by the name Man, half the novel. And so there's a strangeness to it. And it reminds me a little bit of the strangeness, too, of when you realize that like George Orwell's 1984, the bad place is actually North America.
Yeah.
There's something about like the kind of slipperiness of the politics in this that is both very provocative and unsettling at the same time.
So I've been wanting on the podcast for a while to find a way to start to talk about libertarianism in science fiction, which, is obviously it's a big thing. Heinlein is a big part of that. And I don't want to get too far into like analyzing Heinlein's whole career and place in the field. I think it's fair to say he is one of like the major voices, at least like an early period or a formative period of science fiction. And he's got some pretty weird ideas that he addresses in his novels, and I think people have picked up on. I don't. It's a sociological question how much this influenced people versus, say, Atlas Shrugged, right? Which is like American conservative politicians routinely reference that. I don't know how often the moon is harsh mistress comes up as much, at least in people who hold power positions. But this is very comparable to Rand in its vision. It takes like half a second of thinking to realize how incredibly screwed up it is, right? The thing that is kind of freaky about it is, Rand's vision is this kind of basically just anti-communism, right? Just like assume that any good impulse in humanity is bad, right? Assume that we should just elevate selfishness over everything. And that's kind of Rand's system. This is a little more than that, but what it's adding is basically this very spooky bullshit kind of pioneer ethos, right? And this idea that like, if we're out there free and lawless, that will be better and we will make our own systems that will be more just. And then you look at what the own systems that will be more just are here, and they're just mob violence and ignoring the fact that people rely on each other for support. And basically like ignoring the fact that there is society, right? Like the amount that they rail against the idea of taxes, and they rail against the idea. They say, at one point, one character, I don't know if it's Manny or the professor, says that the unkindest thing you can do to a starving man is to give him food. And they mean that. That's a genuine statement in the book. Which again, you have to wonder about satirical distance, but it seems in the moment like it's real. When Manny is on Earth, and he's Manny and the professor are like sort of like arguing for the moon's freedom and trying to negotiate. They have this bit where he's being interviewed and he talks about how like, oh yeah, we don't have healthcare. Healthcare would be evil. If you're worried about your health, you go place a bet with a bookie, and they'll pay if you get sick. And like that's the solution. Like,
the strangeness here though. So on the one hand, you have a novel divided into 3 parts or 3 books, the third book of which is entitled, I'm not sure how to pronounce this exactly, but Tanztafel, right? Which has a vaguely Russian kind of sound going along with the novel's strange incorporation of vaguely Russian words, but actually is an acronym, right? Standing for There Ain't No Such Thing as Free Lunch, which maybe condenses a lot of what's going on with the kind of libertarian streak in this novel. On the other hand, the one thing I would kind of push back with is there's a weird contradiction in the narrative here. Because on the one hand, you do get these long speeches, and you're right, there's a lot of talking heads in this novel. In fact, there's a computer that's basically just a talking head at a certain level, who are sort of espousing these kind of like rugged individualistic versions of the pioneer man. But on the other hand, you get the descriptions of what these characters' connections actually are to one another, and you get a kind of collective dimension that's kind of ineradicable. So you get polyamorous sets of relationships with multiple husbands. There's a kind of a much higher ratio of men to women on the moon, and the moon is a harsh mistress, and so there had to be like new social systems and new kinds of relationship systems to handle that. So on the one hand, you get these like, it's a compliment when any man like whistles after a woman in this novel, right? This is like a kind of moon ritual. Like if there's a good looking, cisgendered woman, then like all the men whistle at her and she appreciates it. So there's that element. Then on the other hand, you have these almost matriarchal familial systems that are also supporting the revolution. And so it's a novel that's like a bag of contradictions in a lot of ways, where on the one hand, you've got like all of these moments that are so clearly a libertarian fantasy, but then on the other hand, you have these kinds of social formations that are just, sort of founded on solidarity, maybe founded, and this is, I think, something you see in a lot of terraforming fiction, is there are these cooperative relationships that are an effect of the environment, of like the harshness of the environment that's, not completely terraformed. And so you have to sort of make allowances for kind of connections that you might need on the moon, but not otherwise on Earth, right? And so that it's fascinating to me because I'm not sure if there's a good way to sort of reconcile these contradictions except to say like, oh, okay, well, Heinlein was actually libertarian and kind of strange right-winger, and so therefore like the parts that really matter are the parts where he's like espousing this philosophy. But the other stuff, like the plot doesn't move. The revolution doesn't happen in this novel without these collective relationships. So,
I think that, not to make this just a I go after libertarians podcast, but I think that speaks to the libertarianism as a project. I should just be blunt. I think it's a very specific, complex form of stupidity. You have to be like right? Like you have to be able to have these big ideas, these big abstract notions of freedom and rights as sort of the core of it, but then you need to be stupid enough to ignore both the sort of like logical follow through of that and like the empirical fact of how things work in reality. And that feels like that here, right? And yeah, there's you can visualize a version of this novel that would totally fall back on these big, giant polyamorous families as sort of like the root of what they're trying to do. But instead, what it's doing here is it's sort of, very fictionally setting up this situation that excuses this neo-chauvinism that they can do. And two, it's magically providing what society does, which is exactly what they want to get rid of, right? They want to get rid of the feeling that we're in it together. And if you just did that on the moon, you would die starving for air. And if you did that on Earth, you would, eventually just die of starvation anyway. But what Heinlein does by having these families there, it sort of erases that. Well, families aren't the same thing as government, right? Families aren't the same thing as society. And so, yeah, it's really weird. It's an interesting attempt to reconcile that contradiction, but it has its own issues. And like, again, just to be blunt, just to ding this book, like, what is it with libertarians and pedophilia? Like, this is just an entire novel in some ways justifying getting rid of statutory laws and connecting like 14-year-olds marrying their own grandparents as the only economically viable way to have a society. And it is bonkers. Like, I don't know, when I was reading this now, I was like jotting down like fake blurbs for it. And it was like a couple of AI enthusiasts who hate taxes and love pedophilia destroy America. Like, I'm glad that would never happen, right? Like,
yeah, no, I mean, this is the thing is, so I've been writing recently on Elon Musk's Martian settlement program and, the handful of details that he's actually managed to give about it. And there is a kind of like similar sort of libertarian structure where, you're trying to imagine, okay, how do we settle this place that's going to be so inhabitable that we absolutely have to work together? It's like the Martians in the Expanse series, either the television show or the novels, or for that matter, Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars trilogy, right? You have to work together in this context. But on the other hand, we're going to figure out ways to reproduce like ways of siloing off one another, right? Ways of reproducing a kind of hyper-competitive and individualistic society on the moon, on Mars. At a certain level, I think you're right. Like, on the one hand, like the pedophilia seems like you could imagine this novel without that. But on the other hand, there's something about libertarianism that sort of is smuggled within it, which is, of course, that part of the whole point is to imagine these kind of pleasurable intensities that you can't get to if society's busy regulating you, right? Like, what if we just finally let our libidos loose? What if we finally just let desires roam free, right? That's one form of anarchism, I suppose.
Yeah, well, and I think also, and I think part of what he's leaning into here is libertarianism works when you have a sort of abstract agent who is fully rational and fully abled and fully self-reliant, right? So you don't get sick, you don't get disabilities, your mental faculties are always perfectly working well, so you never get suckered by other people. And it doesn't really have a way to handle any gradation in that, including considering the fact that like young people actually do need to have a slightly different set of rules operating, right? Until you're a full adult. Like there's a reason for that, but that doesn't work in this system. I don't know. It's interesting bringing up like thinking about the Expanse and thinking about quote unquote real world plans to colonize Mars and thinking about the not the left hand darkness, but the Dispossessed, right? Which is not long after, maybe like a decade after this. What's that, like 73, 74, something like that? That is also about anarchists, right? And also on I don't know if it's terraformed or just inhospitable world where it's said that it's the harsh conditions that sort of drive them towards something like, in that case, kind of a communistic kind of setup. But I don't know, just thinking about how you reconcile the real dangers of something like being in space with wanting to have this sort of like libertarian thing. Like there's this point after the revolution has kind of been kicking off a bit where they start privatizing everything. And I'm just like, you're privatizing all the stuff you need when there's no air to breathe? And we mentioned in the run-up, there's been people that write back to Heinlein, and that's one of those things that Ian MacDonald in the New Moon books really goes hard on, is like, what would a libertarian society look like on the moon? And it's brutal. It's just miserable because it would be. And so, I don't know, there's got to be some kind of balance, and it's not, I think, likely to arise from the Free Luna model.
And I think, one of the things that you often see happen in terraforming novels is that the very idea of terraforming, right? The very idea of making these non-Earth planets like Earth, right? Like remaking them so that they're habitable, so that they sustain human life in some way. It often has this kind of logic in it where you have to imagine the planet as kind of like raw material in the most grandiose fashion that can just be molded like clay. And, the smarter terraforming novels, I'm thinking of Robinson's work, I'm thinking of Newitz's work to some degree, recognizes that these systems that make up these planets are so complex that it's not that simple. Mm-hmm. But they often rely on these like scientist engineer characters. And indeed, that's what we get in Heinlein's The Moon is a Harsh Mistress. We get this engineer character, Manny. We get his, scientist professor friend, and they become these kinds of experts that are capable of navigating the irrational emotions of the people surrounding them and manipulating those emotions. And so you end up kind of reduplicating on a kind of social level this idea that these planets are out for the taking, right? That we can just like turn the universe into one big, sort of colonial space that we can transform planets into these, kind of reserves for human life. But then that requires these like self-sufficient experts who can manipulate things, and not just land, but also the people that are going to be there. And so it's a strange like emphasis on the one hand on like equality and egalitarianism here in a kind of like fantastic libertarian version of it that doesn't work. But then on the other hand, it's also kind of, the main characters kind of have to dupe the rest of the loonies, as they're called, the folks living on the moon, kind of have to dupe them into their freedom.
You would think that in someone like a radically libertarian, radically anarchist kind of thing, there would be some sense here of like consensus as an important thing, or like letting people choose what they want to do. And just, there's the one character who like posits like, oh, what we really need is a king. Manny and the professor, they don't contradict him. They just kind of look at him like, I don't know. And it's just that immediate pivot from I'm willing to fight and die for libertarianism to, oh, but maybe a king would be the best way to run things. Again, fortunately not something I'm thinking about in terms of politics today. Fortunately, that's not something we're seeing. Oof.
No, I know.
Yeah, I do want to say, though, there's something interesting about, I was thinking about this on a style level, because I know that's something I want to talk about a little bit with Newitz as well. And there is something, on the one hand, I'm kind of like, how is this guy so famous? On the one hand, I'm like, why is Heinlein the guy we put up on a pedestal so much? And I was looking at the timeline of like when other stuff was written. So like Dune wins the Hugo the year before this. And like Herbert, another, libertarian crank. But like writing at a very different level than this. This is a very different kind of writing than this. The Moon is a Harsh Mistress beats Delaney's Babel 17, which again, very different level of writing than this. Le Guin is writing at this time. Left Hand comes out just a couple years later. Very different kind of writing than this. So on the one hand, I was kind of like really feeling pretty bad about science fiction as a community elevating Heinlein so much. But then as I was reading this, I'm like, but this also kind of like whips along. And he's doing some really weirdly smart things at a structural level. And even though the fake Russian is weird, I never felt tripped up. Like I'd be tripped up by like when they whistle at a woman, or like when they marry a 14-year-old, or some of the things they say would just be like, whoa. But in terms of like reading it, there is this weird way where it like really cracks along, and it feels like, I don't know, like kind of the epitome of a certain kind of pulpy writing, and he's like jamming it full of speeches. Well, or to compare it for that matter with Ayn Rand, right? Like I think, Atlas Shrugged is basically unreadable, right? It's just horrific. So hard to get through. This is also just all speeches by libertarians. It's like 95% speeches by weight, but it kind of rips. It kind of like, it reads, it goes right along. I don't know. That's a weird contradiction.
No, and it's the link. I'll read just a couple sentences from the second paragraph of the novel to give folks a sense. My old man taught me two things: mind own business and always cut cards. Politics never tempted me. There's all of this language in this novel about how horrible politics is. Nobody that's doing politics wants to do politics, which is another kind of libertarian thing, right? Because what they mean there is a kind of formal politics. But this, like, my old man taught me two things: mind no business and always cut cards. It has almost the quality of a kind of like Western in its simplicity. There's a kind of simplicity in the level of the syntax. These sentences are all pretty simple in terms of their setup, but then they have these weird moments of like throwing some Russian in, throwing some German in. that you can always make out from context, but it is a kind of, I had to look up again. It was like, this isn't one of the juvenilia novels, is it? And it's not quite, but it kind of is, you know? You know, I don't know if I would want to hand this to a 12-year-old boy, but they could read it.
They could read it, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
You know, we were talking about in a previous episode, we talked about Joe Walton's Among Others, where the teenage narrator of that reads this and other Heinlein novels and picks it up, right? And like gets it and like is embracing it and thinking about the ideas in it, which has its own problems because it's also introducing some of these really problematic ideas of Heinlein to a very impressionable reader. But like, yeah, you can, I don't know, it's a weird, this shouldn't be as approachable as it is, and it shouldn't be as much fun as it is, and somehow it is. And that makes me think that I'm miscalculating a little bit when I want to call Heinlein a bad writer, because he's doing some stuff here that really works. It's weird.
And it's tricky too, because I think you pointed out, you know, the history of this moment. This is a transitional moment where we're moving out of like, call it maybe the second sort of period of science fiction literary production towards a new wave moment, right? Where there's this kind of like contest to try to give science fiction literary value, right? And you get your Delaney's, you get your New Worlds magazine, you get, you know, Le Guin. Most of these people are not serializing a lot of their work, although New Worlds is serializing some of this stuff. But you still have Heinlein ticking along, doing his like pulpy stuff that's gonna, you know, go back to like Asimov's and Analogs and things like that. And that really is reflective of that early 20th century moment that was much more interested in a kind of like military colonial version of science fiction. And I think it's interesting too, looking at it back from our moment, because I think we're also in a kind of transitional moment in terms of science fiction as a kind of like creative field where we do have like, you don't want to say literary writers stealing all the good sci-fi tropes, but kind of, while disavowing science fiction at the same time when they can, with some exceptions. And then, you know, so it's interesting to see these transitional moments and the kind of wonky prose that comes out of them.
Well, I mean, he's writing, you know, maybe those transitions are that he's writing from a time, and until maybe fairly recently, science fiction, the sort of top level indicator is all at the ideational level, right? Like, what are the ideas this book is doing? And that's what determines if it's science fiction or not. And now we're getting at this point where most of the sort of like the bag of Nova is like, you know, well known enough to the average reader that, yeah, you can get people writing outside of, quote unquote, outside of the genre about robots and spaceships and all this kind of stuff. But then it makes you think, okay, well then what is the genre community? What's the distinction then? Yeah, that's interesting. I wanted one, this is unrelated to style, but in the ongoing interest of not contributing to the delusional space colonial complex, is I don't want to necessarily ding Heinlein for this because I don't think he would have known this at the time, but on a terraforming level, he doesn't seem to know that there are no volatiles on the moon. And the whole system is based on farming and exporting. And I'm just like, where is the carbon coming from? Where is the phosphorus and the nitrogen coming from? And like, again, this is pre-moon landing. I don't know how much they knew about the composition of the moon at that point, but it's just one of those things that I want to call out because, again, like all of these narratives about how easy it will be to colonize Mars, how easy it will be to colonize other planets, they all hinge on like ignoring like these massive, simple, like brute chemical realities. And the lack of carbon on the moon is one of them.
One of the weird moments towards the sort of middle part of the novel is a discussion of catapulting, I believe is the term, basically fertilizing elements up to the moon, right? And they're like, at one point, so first of all, this is a novel, just so folks know, this is a novel in which the entire various groups that make up the sort of South Asian subcontinent are referred to as Hindus, just blanket reference to Indian people, Pakistani people, and so on. But at one point, like one of the characters is like, yeah, we can sort of produce even more grain if you guys just line up all your cows that you're not using and just like basically fling this shit up to the moon, you know, and we'll be fine. We'll I think they say that we'll multiply our grain production by 10. And you know, there's these underground farms, which I have to imagine seems also like a very hard way to farm. And yeah, there's a lot of moments where you're kind of like,
there's this,
okay.
There's a moment specifically where the professor talking about like these plans for catapulting stuff back and forth, and someone's bringing up like, actually, it's really expensive to catapult stuff into space. And he basically brushes it off and he's like, that's just a technical problem. I'm sure it'll get solved. And it rhymes so hard with how we talk about like, you know, right now, the only quote unquote realistic plans to deal with climate change are to have carbon capture technology, which just flat out doesn't exist at scale, right? And that just rhymes so hard with this sort of attitude to this. Like, no, actually leaving a gravity well is like a pretty simple equation. You can do it more or less efficiently, but it's going to take energy to get out. And shipping poop to the moon just, it's not like, I don't know, there's all that stuff about, I was reading an interesting thing recently about how we get down on international shipping, but actually just shipping stuff by water is like so mind-blowingly carbon efficient that it's like, it's just hard. It's hard to wrap your head around the fact that like, if I drive to the store, a quarter of a mile away or half a mile away or whatever, and buy some pears that were grown in Chile and bring them back home or wherever they're from, like that probably costs like 3 or 4 times as much carbon as it took to ship them like around the world, just because of like efficiencies, Anyways, it's not the same when you're going to the moon, and never will be. So I'm trying to say.
I mean, I think one of the important things too to think about with like terraforming as like a concept is that so often as like a trope in fiction and science fiction, it is both a way of like highlighting certain political dimensions, but also then like resolving them or solving them or eliminating them through like engineering prowess, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, there's this great book by Holly Buck called After Geoengineering. And one of the things that Buck is like a kind of lefty who has a certain amount of sympathy for the possibilities opened up by geoengineering, which is to say terraforming the earth itself.
Right, yeah.
But she always like caveats that with the fact that like any kind of project where you're going to modify planetary systems needs to go hand in hand with an egalitarian social project, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can't expect the one to come from the other, right? They have to actually go hand in hand. And I think one of the things that you see in The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, and maybe less so in Italy Newitz's The Terraformers, is this way in which engineering swallows up politics, right? Which is an old science fiction problem, right? What if we could engineer our way out of all of those difficult human foibles that have us sort of competing with one another or getting into various kinds of social conflicts? And I think that's another aspect here too, is that we also, I will take some hand waving in my terraforming science fiction if it has a kind of more acute sense of the politics that are involved. But on the other hand, so often it's like these long passages describing, like carbon capture, how we're going to like increase the carbon rate in the atmosphere and then take it back down and blah, blah, blah. Who knows if those engineering schemes ever actually work? I don't think we'll know until we actually try them. But yeah, you get this kind of like narrative elimination of politics often.
Did you read Termination Shock? Neil Stephenson's?
Yeah, some years ago. I think I read it shortly after it came out, which wasn't bad for a Stevenson novel. He has all the
weird politics, very readable. But yeah, that's about like rational individual actors. I think they're like, are they like insurance? No, they're real estate moguls, right? Decide that they need to do geoengineering because they're going to lose too much property to sea level rise. Anyways, don't have time to get into that one. But one of the stranger things about this, and again, like as I'm reading this novel and sort of like writing down my lists of things I want to shame and or mock it for, but then I keep having this little question mark, like, wait a second, is there some ironic or satirical distance here? I don't know. One of the things that I can't decide what I think about is the artificial intelligence, Mike, because it's a genie in a bottle. Like it like rips away all semblance of like quote unquote realism, like hard science fiction here, right? Because the entire book hinges on I secretly found and befriended the secret all-powerful AI that no one else knows about who runs the entire revolution. And like there's not a single plot point here that would happen without that. And on the one hand, I'm like, maybe that's just kind of weak, or maybe that's like cluing us in to take this less seriously. I don't know.
Yeah, it's definitely a kind of like narrative shortcut at the very least, right? Like I'm trying to imagine what this novel would be without Mike, the AI, the supercomputing AI. The answer is not much would happen, right? Like life would just go on. It's the fact that Mike has become a sentient being that kind of kickstarts everything in it, right? Yeah, there's this way in which it's kind of shortcut. Mike's also kind of like a chummy machine in a lot of ways. One of the kind of subplots is that Mike is trying to learn how to tell jokes. And so he's, doing these printouts of like thousands of jokes at a time that he's crafted to have the different humans that he's friends with see which are funny. They even distinguish it between like funny once, funny repeatedly, and so there is this kind of like I don't know if that's satirical, but there is moments where you can tell Heinlein is having fun with the language here. He's having fun, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know what to make of that. But let's, we need to keep moving here. So
the terraformers.
Let's go to the terraformers. I only knew it. So yeah, tell me your thoughts on this book. You wanted to bring this book up in conversation with this, and it makes sense, but I'm still trying to kind of fit it. I don't know how to say this. There's a way that they're the same thing, and they're the way, like I said, that they don't. I don't know quite how they mesh. It's like the Moon is a Harsh Mistress is playing checkers, and the terraformers is playing the saxophone. It's just like two different. Not quite sure.
Well, it's funny because there's like a tonal similarity, right? There's a kind of like zaniness, if not from page one, then certainly by the time you get to the third part of this novel. I mean, in a lot of ways, this is three novellas kind of cobbled together as a single novel. And I think it works structurally in that respect. But, by the time you get to the third novella, you're dealing with like a romantic relationship between a sentient train and a journalist cat, which is always what I like to tell people. And it either makes sure that they never read it or makes sure they like go out and buy it right away. But so there's a kind of zaniness here. On the flip side, on a very explicit level, Annalee Newitz has politics that I much prefer to Robert Heinlein's politics, right? There is there's another narrative of revolution here, and I'm really interested in how we narrate revolution. I think one of the interesting aspects here is one of the reasons it's divided into three kind of novellas is because you have these huge time skips between them, like thousands of years that kind of skipped, or hundreds of years at points between one part of the novel and another, and it's working along timelines of tens of thousands of years, sometimes with characters that are living for hundreds of years. And so part of what fascinates me there is this thinking about revolution as this long-term project of actually changing our social relationships and how we interact with one another, not just our government, which is a very kind of like 1960s kind of cultural revolution, social revolution sort of idea. But then on the other hand, there is a sarcastic door in this novel. There's a sarcastic door. There are like mounts, as in hybrid non-human animal machine, like horses or cows that fly and that also end up falling in love on their own, and so have to leave one part of the planet and go to another to be with their loved ones. And it's just a zany, kind of strange novel about corporate control and what it would look like if we just kept on expanding what some folks are now calling techno-feudalism to a, literally interstellar level.
Yeah, this novel, I have a hard time with this novel on kind of like a few different levels. But the revolution stuff is what's interesting, and that slowness to it is interesting. I should just get it off my chest. Is that I think
tell me your gripes.
Yeah, so my gripes, first of all, like on a prose level, this novel trips me up. Not every page, but very frequently. It just has some very strange, I don't know if it's choices, I don't know if it's editing or lack thereof, I'm not sure. There are multiple points in this where I kind of paused and I was like, not even is this like a YA novel, but I'm like, is this like for middle grade readers? Where it will kind of like, it'll do this thing where it'll like countersync or like triple sync what's happening on the page, and it's really, really obvious. Like, this is not a direct quote, but it'll be like, this character yelled angrily, they were mad, like that kind of like where it like will kind of like say what's really obvious. I wrote down, this is kind of a little one, but it just kind of like made me put the book down. So the sort of like seat of one of the revolutions is the society that has somehow been secret for 1,000 years.
The Volcano Society.
The Volcano Society. I don't really want to get into how they've been secret for 1,000 years. But so this dormant volcano called Spider, and it says, they're looking like a map of it. It says, radiating outward from Spider's base were long rocky ridges, the signs of underground tunnels created by subterranean lava flows. From above, the mountain looked like a tropical tarantula, its swollen blue abdomen surrounded by splayed legs. That's why everybody called it Spider. And it's just kind of like, again, like if this were like in a middle grade novel, I'd let that go. But that kind of stuff just happens a lot here. And I don't want to dwell on it too much. Just the prose tripped me up a lot. And I was, to be maybe kind of charitable about it, I was wondering if maybe this is a holdover from Newitz writing nonfiction books about science for like non-specialists, and like kind of like making this sort of like accessible and like making sure you get the points. But it also has a sort of, particularly with how the characters are written, it has this kind of like simple transparency where it just flat out tells you what everyone is feeling at all times. There's never any like depth to it. There's never any really like framing in terms of interiority or, yeah. Anyways, so that's just a thing that bugged me a little bit about it. The other thing that bugs me about it, and this is something I'm actually interested in, and I don't really want to ding the book for it. I'm more interested in this in sort of like my critical response as a reader, because I know this varies a lot between people, is there are, the easiest way to say this is there are weirdly large science, I don't want to say mistakes. There are very strange handling of things that seem like raise like immediate flags and questions that the book doesn't think about. So for one example is that in the history of the terraforming of this planet, before there was an oxygen atmosphere, they made the Archaean people. So they are basically human-looking people who exist in a non or extremely low oxygen environment.
Right.
So first off, I'm like, oxygen is important metabolically. Are they anaerobic? It never says that. If they are, like, what are they eating and breathing to enable that? So that's just weird, but whatever. I put that aside. But then those people persist into the current timeline of the book. And even though we're told at multiple points they have like the capacity, because it seems like, I don't know if it's explicit, but it seems like most people aren't born via like a biological parent. They're like sort of created, decanted, I think is the term they use, right?
Yes.
So it's never clear to me why they don't just adjust that in the next generation so that they can breathe normal air. And it's explicitly stated that there are species, there's the like kind of like Cape dogs that are intelligent, who can toggle between the two atmospheres. So I'm like, so why wouldn't the Archaeans do that at least? And then so if you are in I think actually they refer to it as like a high carbon atmosphere. So you have characters from like a fairly normal Earth atmosphere and then these characters from this like no oxygen, maybe high carbon atmosphere. Those are mutually lethal. Like they would kill you very quickly. And they just kind of continue living like that and like have these little breathers that are like the size of septum rings. And that just takes care of it. And it's a weird thing to set up and describe and then not like sort of like provide more of a hand wave. Like I'm very forgiving to hand waves. Like give me a thing and I'll like be like, okay, you thought about that and you're not going to lay out the chemistry for me, but you're just going to tell me to not worry about it. The book never tells me to not worry about it. So I do. And that's just one example. And there's quite a few others, but that's sort of just something in how I read. And I know that varies person to person. I was thinking a lot reading this about quote unquote suspension of disbelief and what that is. And this book sort of threw me into a spiral of kind of not believing it and sort of like it set up in me, the reader, this kind of like antagonistic relationship. And then once I'm in there, I'm less able to forgive things that in the exact same phrase in another book, I would have just enjoyed or at least just like kind of glided over, right? And I don't want to like make scientific accuracy some kind of like pinnacle that we ask for in science fiction, because I think that's a little bit of a wild snipe chase, even when the science is really firm. Because how do you explain reality, you know? And there are certainly books where like, Kim Stanley Robinson is someone I think of as a fairly hard science fiction writer. But if you want to get into the weeds, like, will the asteroids hang together if they're spinning fast enough to create gravity? Like, I don't know. Like, does the ping ball gravity loop trick in Aurora work if they're close to the speed of light? Like, I don't know. There are things you could definitely pick apart. And so I'm trying to like be mindful of the fact that this varies in how it like triggers this flip in me of whether or not I believe it. And for whatever reason, the Archaean gas thing, the refusal to put the anti-grav stuff in non-sentient things, it makes a bunch of these like big choices that really seem like they should affect the book a lot, and they don't, and it just bugs me.
I wonder too if because I think I'm less susceptible to that, but I think I understand what you're saying, and I wonder, the second acknowledgement in this book is to Kim Stanley Robinson, and it's a kind of a funny one. It says, Kim Stanley Robinson, author of many geoengineering epics, told me jokingly that he would permit me to write about terraforming as long as I included a character named Kim, and so I have, and so when you read Robinson, right, like I think the thing that Robinson does really well is on the one hand, he recognizes that politics is distinct from engineering and science, right? But on the other hand, he pulls out political moments from engineering and technical problems, right? This is something that actually Mackenzie Wark in their book, Molecular Red is really good on. She says, like, look, for like Robinson, there is a politics to engineering as well as a politics on its own. And that's really good because, like, you know, Robinson's going to do these long info dumps, these long descriptive passages where he's going to explain to you exactly how they like get more carbon into the atmosphere of Mars or something like that, right, in order to increase the heat. I wonder if the problem with Newitz is that it sits sort of uncomfortably between what we sometimes think of as like quote unquote hard and quote unquote soft sci-fi, where on the one hand, it's providing a lot more of the details in a way that we think that hard sci-fi tends to do. But on the other hand, those details are still pretty much placeholders for already worked out political positions. And so the point with the folks that live in like the spider volcano, right, the Homo archaeans, the point there is that they represent an indigenous group, right? And, you know, Newitz talks about the research they've done on indigenous folks and the folks, you know, sort of experts they've talked to on indigenous studies in writing this novel. And you get a sense then that like the technical matters are really, really subordinate to the kind of political allegory at work here. And that raises questions of like, okay, like, yeah, on the one hand, I get it. We have the real estate company Verdant, who at any given time is probably terraforming a bunch of planets at once. Sort of kind of like interstellar real estate company. But, you know, how realistic or practical it is to imagine the kind of like sheer scale enormity that would involve investment-wise on like multiple planets at once. But let's just, you know, if we give it to there, then like we realize that like this is a kind of platform for working out a kind of corporate versus anti-corporate power, like corporate power versus a kind of anti-capitalist politics. And everything else seems kind of subordinate to that, for better or worse.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely something to that about the idea of these like kind of like standing in for, kind of like just being set up to kind of plug contemporary ideas and issues into it. And I don't say that as a negative, because I think almost all good science fiction is doing that, you know, to some extent or another. But there's something about the there's a lot of times when there are ideas in this book where I'm like, okay, I see what you're doing there, but it's kind of been plugged into this secondary world without adjusting it so that it makes sense for the secondary world. A big one in this is that carbon neutral is used as a sort of like unquestioned virtuous good. And it comes up early. It comes up in the first chapter. It comes up repeatedly throughout. Like when they're talking about something, like if something is good, it's carbon negative. And if it's not carbon negative, it's bad. This is not Earth. This is a terraformed planet. There are literally no fossil fuels because they have created the biosphere. Like there have not been millennia, you know, there have not been millions and millions of years to create fossil fuels they could burn. And this idea that like the fragility of the planet is something that like it makes sense to me to want to protect it, that they've worked on it. But this idea that like one person having a campfire could quote unquote set the project back centuries. And I was like, that does not make sense for any ecosystem, like evolved or otherwise, that would be that fragile. And this, the way it talks about carbon really just kind of shows its hand that it's just kind of moving stuff from our world into here without thinking about it. And to me, it weakens some of what it could be doing. And I think a thing that I was really interested in this novel is it is very concerned with, it has a sort of bedrock ethics that of conserving the environment, of protecting the natural world. And it's not a natural world. It's been made from a lifeless planet for people to come there. And there's this sort of like, it's just very strange to me how strongly almost all of our viewpoint characters feel about protecting, you know, what's just been set up for people to move to.
You know, there's this imaginary book within the novel, which I don't know about you, but I always love when there's like these imaginary books in a novel. And this one is called the Environmental Rescue Team Handbook. And so, you know, we're following this like kind of almost like half corporate, half civil service entity called the Environmental Rescue Team. A lot of our main characters like Destry are from this kind of team especially before we meet these Homo archaeans that are living in this secret volcano. And at the beginning of chapters, we get like epigraphs that are from this imaginary book. And chapter 2 has the epigraph, "Home is a bargain with nature." Right? Which I think when I reviewed this novel, I think that was maybe the title of my review or something. And you're right, there's something kind of funny there, kind of like 1970s deep nature version of environmentalism that, you're right. Seems kind of off to be on a terraformed planet, but also speaks to the fact that, the Terra in terraforming is Earth, and what it means to terraform is to make a planet Earth-like.
Mm-hmm.
But does that actually make any sense, right? Like, what does it even mean to make a planet Earth-like? Do you just mean habitable for humans? Do you mean habitable for humans with a minimal amount of infrastructure? Do you mean humans can actually walk on the planet, like, without having breathing equipment? And there's a whole sort of set of assumptions embedded very often in terraforming fictions that eventually will get to the place where this is, quote unquote, just another Earth. And where I think it's different for Newitz is that, for one thing, this novel is what I would call like a post-Anthropocene novel, because in a kind of very offhanded way, it talks about how the Anthropocene was solved during the farm revolutions back on Earth, thousands of years ago. And this is maybe the kind of like dominant structural trope in this novel, like the kind of thing that makes this novel work, which is that the farm revolutions made it so that humans could talk to non-humans, right? So that they could talk to non-human animals like cows and horses and naked mole rats, which indeed are characters in this novel. Maybe some of my favorite characters are the naked mole rat engineers, but also like talking doors, talking trains, and so on and so forth. And so I think one of the things that happens is that all of the kind of like reimagining things at the level of infrastructure that you would usually think needs to happen in a terraforming novel, that somebody like Robinson is really good at, right? Like, I think maybe Robinson is the best at that, even if you don't like it, right? He's really good at imagining new infrastructure. But instead of doing that, Newitz, and I think this is actually very common in their fiction, going back to Autonomous, imagines new bodies, right? Like, characters have different kinds of bodies, all the characters, all the kind of living beings, in the widest sense of the term, that include like animate machines, like machines that aren't just simple robots. Like, all of these creatures can talk to one another, communicate to one another, and be part of the community with one another. And so the question, instead of being like, how do we make another planet habitable? Because that's almost taken for granted. Instead, it's, how do we talk to one another? How do we, like, literally, how do we have sex with one another when we have different genitalia? That actually becomes a thing at one point in the novel. And they're like, the Homo archaeans are described as having genitalia that are more like flower stamens or something. They're described in terms of petals and stamen and things like that. And so, like, it all gets displaced onto that.
As a total aside, do you know Roy Orbison wrapped in cling film?
I don't.
It's an elaborate fantasy about Roy Orbison wrapped in cling film. I was thinking about that through one of the sex scenes here, where they have to do this sort of like whole body monomolecular.
That's right.
Yeah, it's good. No, that point about the body, that's interesting. That changes how I look at the novel a little bit. This is not a critique. This is an observation that I have weird feelings about with the book. Is about that idea of like the great bargain, right? The great bargain they talk about.
The great bargain, yeah. The farm revolution is the great bargain, yeah.
Yeah. That's really interesting. And the idea of there being more kinds of consciousness and more kinds of things being conscious is something I'm really interested in, and I'm really interested in science fiction. And I was trying to decide in this book how much it's kind of trying to think about it on the metaphorical level as opposed to the sort of in-world level. Because on the in-world level, it gets real weird real fast, and I almost wish it would have pushed at it more. There's a social refusal in this book that's never explained to have non-sentient vehicles. And that's never explained. It's never said why you can't have a bicycle that doesn't think for itself or whatever.
Which might be slightly more ethical than having a flying cow that's probably going to get annoyed after a while.
Right. And they don't put the anti-grav technology in anything that's not a person. They also just don't put it in everybody, which seems like anyways, maybe it's really expensive. I don't know. But it doesn't look at like, what would it mean to have a human level intelligence and you control some doors for thousands of years? Like, I feel like that's actually an interesting question of like, what kind of mentality could stay sane, or would it stay sane? I think there's some like kind of like social repercussion is like, if your trains are fully sentient and they occasionally stop doing their train routes to go solve mysteries, what does that do? And on the level of the ecosystem, I assume that the naked mole rats don't have predators and they don't die screaming between the jaws of hawks or something, right? Like, they give consciousness to earthworms here, and I'm kind of like, does nothing eat the earthworms? From that point on, like, what happens there? To me, that's fascinating. And I think there's on the one hand, it's doing this science fiction thing of thinking of new kinds of bodies and this sort of like proliferation and this diversity. The what's the old Star Trek infinite diversity and infinite forms? Shoot, how's that go? Anyways, an easier way for me to read it is on the level of like extending respect to more and more things, right? And they talk about trying to think of the river as a person, right? And I think in reality, I think that's one of probably the more hopeful ways for actually making a sustainable Earth, right? It's like extending legal and social rights to more kinds of entities.
Right. And there are precedents for this, right?
Yeah.
There are precedents for this. I'm thinking in particular of Indigenous folks in Australia, like that have actually managed to successfully win the recognition of a degree of personhood for specific landmarks that are important in their spiritual life, cliff faces, bodies of water. This is obviously when the sort of Dakota pipeline was being built. There was a lot of discussion about like not only the rights of the people to that land, indigenous peoples, but also the rights of the river itself.
I believe a couple South American countries have passed legislation about
Bolivia,
various,
certainly.
Bolivia rivers and watersheds. Yeah, so
it is funny, so on page like 237, there's this moment because I had that same question, like, what does it mean to be a sentient train? Because frankly, I want my trains to be like trains in Berlin. I want them to run on time and get me from point A to point B efficiently,
Yeah.
It's like I don't want them joking around and so they forget to pick me up or something. But there's this moment where they're talking about all these boring trains and there's like boring vehicles that are actually producing underground tunnels for this volcanic society. And people are worried about like, oh, what if we make the trains sentient and they don't work out? And at one point, the boring machines are making this sort of case for sentient trains, and they say something along the lines of, we of the boring fleet are not programmed to enjoy making subterranean infrastructure, but like all creatures, we find it satisfying to do things that our bodies excel at, right? And so there is this like long kind of like argument of natural rights, that goes back to this idea that like certain kinds of bodies have certain kinds of like needs and desires embedded in them. And like, if you take this in the most general way, there's this concept of conatus in Spinoza, this Jewish philosopher Baruch Spinoza, kind of like radical philosopher, wrote this Ethics in which he said that like every being, not even just like living beings, has what he calls conatus, which is like the desire to persevere in their being, which doesn't just mean staying the same, but like doing that which in them is kind of like essential to their nature. On the one hand, that can be like really radical. Like, okay, like a train's nature is to transport. So of course it's going to enjoy realizing that aspect of its potential. But on the other hand, like that also suggests a kind of really narrow understanding of what beings might do. Like, what do you do with human beings there? Do human beings have a particular like thing that they're designed to do? Is it reproduction? That seems kind of boring.
And especially if you get into, if you're designing a being to have like an essential nature that is its job, that is fairly narrow, that feels weird. That feels like this very strange limiting. I have to date avoided referencing Rick and Morty on this podcast, but it's like the little it's like the little butter robot, right? Like, what is my purpose? To bring me butter, It's like, oh, that's rough. And to say that like, in order for this society to function, you will have to have enough things made for those single use kind of functions that it'll work. I don't know. It's weird. I was thinking about Buber's I and Thou.
Yeah.
In Kaufman's introduction to that, he has this bit where it's a really nice gloss, and he kind of goes a little further on what the theory is. The theory being that like you can relate to things as a subject, or you can relate to things as though they were an object, and it's kind of more fulfilling to interact with them as though they were a you as opposed to an it. Kaufman has this thing. I don't remember exactly what he says, but he says, there's a lot of wisdom in that, but there's also a lot of wisdom in like accepting that you are a means for other people at the things you do, and that there's wisdom there too, that you don't like when you are checking out at the grocery or when you are the person bagging at the groceries. There's an extent to which you don't need to be like a center and a fully like volitional being like in that moment, in that role. I think he talks about Kant, and he says, the wisdom in the categorical imperative is that always also, an ends. If it were just always an ends, you'd be like, oh man, you got to stop and like talk to your train, because if your train's having a bad day, it might not go, and then the whole infrastructure gets screwed up. But always also, right?
There's the show Abbot Elementary, not to do too recent of a reference. And one of the characters, and it's a character I love, I can't remember his name at the moment, but he's taking the bus to work, and he insists every time on having these long conversations with the bus driver. And the transit system's ready to go on strike, and the bus driver finally is like almost like relieved to be on strike, just not to have to talk to this guy. He just wants to drive his bus. He wants to treat it like what it is, which is a job. And there is this level of, one of the things that, because these are two novels about revolution, the Heinlein and the Newitz, and one of the things that I don't think gets enough credit when we're talking about revolution is all the boring moments, right? All the stuff that's not insurrection, all the stuff that's nitty-gritty, boring planning. And I will say, to their credit, one of the things that Newitz does much better than Heinlein, and that, there are, I think, very few sci-fi writers that manage to do this, is not just turn revolution to this exciting thing. Sometimes it's like debates, and there are moments of like just political debates about whether or not to have sentient trains, like whether or not to extend personhood rights to earthworms, right? Which is technically like a violation of a social contract. There are all of these sort of arguments about these kind of nitty-gritty, boring things, but then at the same time, we're going to bring it back to like sex between two persons that don't have the same kind of equipment, let's say, right? That have different genitalia. We're going to bring it back to these kind of funny interpersonal relations, like, what is it like to have your best friend live in a bar near you because your best friend is also a mount that you ride on, and what's going to happen with that mount that you ride on that's also your best friend falls in love with another mount who actually has a different intelligence rating, which I believe is called INAS, which is its own sort of thing.
There's this is absolutely not a knock, but there's a lot of scatological in this. A lot of poops, a lot of turds, a lot of in-ass jokes. That's fine.
There's definitely a way in which Newitz was like, I'm going to do Robinson. I'm going to do Robinson with a more of a sense of humor. I'm going to do Robinson, but zany. I'm going to do Robinson pass through the mill of I Love Lucy,
The revolutionary stuff here, it's interesting. It's strange. So one of the things I mentioned, like one of the reasons this book just doesn't sit totally right with me is it has these sort of assumptions or blind spots that I have a hard time putting my finger on, or maybe they're my own assumptions or blind spots. You have this one sort of concrete moment of revolution with Spider City, right? With they kind of revolt to take control of this river that they need, and there's this moment of armed resistance, and they make a treaty and win, and then, as you say, the other two sections of the novel take place, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years later, and following things. But it's kind of not the same revolution. It's kind of people working towards different things. But the final resolution is basically kind of I was thinking of like a 90s style film, kind of like journalism gotcha, like they put together the weird facts about basically like the IP rights to the DNA, and somehow that wins everything. There's this, like, it is this like far future version of techno-feudalism that is maybe for the best, because I don't think this novel could be zany if it really focused on that. Like the idea that you will have this level of corporate culture that can survive for tens of thousands of years is one of the most depressing ideas I think you could possibly have. But there's this weird way that in the novel, the characters who we're with and we're seeing the world through their eyes and hearing their words, they don't seem to they don't like being slaves, but no one ever says like slavery is bad, right? It's not that I think that Newitz thinks that slavery isn't bad, but like none of them sort of like look at the real fundamentals. The corporation intentionally murders hundreds of people, and at no point is there any suggestion that there might be some recourse, some kind of justice, right? It's just that doesn't cross anyone's mind. No one thinks they just intentionally murdered hundreds of people. We should do something about it. It's just kind of like, no, we need to keep working on like having our own city and like maybe we can become part of this League of Worlds and then we'll have more rights. But no one thinks about justice, and that just sits really weird to me with, again, this fact that like murder and slavery are never addressed head on. It's weird. The characters want to escape it, but none of them like enunciate it. There's no like framework to talk about that.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you, but on the other hand, like the non-violent revolution is premised on the violent revolution having already taken place, right? So there is like, one of the interesting things here is the revolution is a staggered historical affair, right? It's not like a one-off, right? There's like multiple revolutions and revolts with different kinds of effects. And even the way the novel ends, it's not with some kind of like perfect society. It's with, this is a paragraph that I always, love. Saskia was on its way to becoming a public planet, which meant dreams realized for some and regulatory nightmares for others. Emerald's exit would be messy, and probably more companies would pull out too. The governments that grew in their absence would take every possible shape, and none of them would be anywhere near perfect, right? And so it's that kind of like experimental ethos that I think of, something like more along the lines of like Le Guin's Dispossessed or Delaney's Trouble on Triton than with a more like classically utopian fiction in which you get the kind of like boring description of the good place, right? What you're going to get is more mess, right? There's not some clean resolution there. But on the other hand, I get what you're saying. There is a kind of neatness to it that almost is like a narrative problem, by which I mean like the reason that it's a kind of like a gotcha journalism, like muckraker, that like, cat muckraker that ends up saving the day is in part because that makes it really easy to have two characters be the protagonists of the last part of it, right? Sentient train, the train gets us back and forth on a very literal geographical level between different parts of Saskia, of the planet that's being terraformed. And the cat journalist gives us like somebody who's like a literal voice and a communicator and a researcher who can like pull out the facts that, the planet was always a public planet because of legal, kind of chicanery. And so there's a way in which I get, I agree with you. There's a kind of like too easy quality to it. And then on the other hand, on the level of content in terms of like what's actually presented about the future, it's going to be messy, right? And I do appreciate that acknowledgement that like revolution is not this kind of punctual one-off thing, that it's a kind of messy process that might not work out, which is also, by the way, I think a better ending than Heinlein, which is revolution is a messy thing and it definitely won't work out and it's all going to be cyclical and it's not utopia, but at least the mood's independent. It sort of reminds me of the kind of like pessimism in Octavia Butler's Parable novels, especially in the transition to Parable and the Talents, the second novel. But it also reminds me of like, this is probably what things would look like if Elon Musk has his way, right?
Yeah.
Like, if Elon Musk manages to live 1,000 years and like, develop a kind of terraforming company that takes over multiple planets, like this is kind of what it would look like until there was a revolution against it.
Yeah, no, you're totally right. I mean, my only hope in that is I don't think they're actually sustainable to do that. I think it'll implode long before that. But no, you're right.
No, I'm with you.
Let's contemplate the inevitable death of capitalism while we take a quick break. We'll be right back. Okay, we are back. We've been going for a bit on this experimental double title episode, so we want to wrap this up for too long. But we want to talk about, I want to talk about two things real quick if we can. So one is, I want to talk about there ain't no such thing as a free lunch and economy in these two books. I think there's something there. We were talking in the break about revolution and being in this revolution or insurrection and being in this moment, like, to be blunt, where the U.S. government is kind of being captured by corporate forces, rapidly sliding into like a real spooky era internationally, with these sort of like reactionary movements taking control of governments, and thinking about popular revolutions, thinking about what's going on in these two books. And I feel like there's something, because one of the things I was noting when I was reading The Terraformers was thinking about money in it. There's this thing where there is money being paid to the workers, even if they're slaves, ? And they have to pay rent, and like a rent crisis is like one of the parts of the last kind of revolutionary moment that we see. But I was thinking about this in Spider, in the first sequence, when we spend some time there, and then we return to it over the various centuries. I don't know if Spider has money. I'm not sure. They don't come out and say it. But that
doesn't seem like it.
It seems like it might be a kind of like Dispossessed-esque, some sort of like communal, like they have like a rotating chore list that they sign up for. They just kind of like take food when they need it. They're told that they have like the ability to kind of expand their living spaces as need be, so there's no like pressures. They just kind of like pick a room. which interestingly is also like one of the arguments they make about the moon in The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, right? Is that they can sort of like basically have infinitely scalable real estate and farming capacity so that they can like, that can support the kind of freedom that they have in that first one. But obviously these two novels are very opposed. Like the heart of There Ain't No Such Thing as a Free Lunch, I think, is the idea that there's no such thing as society, right? This very like Reaganite, Thatcherist kind of approach to it. And that's very much the opposite of what Newitz is doing, right? And saying that like finding a community and finding good ways to run community is kind of like, that's the whole shebang. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on like how those two things kind of poke at each other.
Yeah, well, this is the funny thing about these novels. You know, I like I said earlier, I call the Terraformers a kind of like post-Anthropocene novel on a very explicit level because it imagines that we've like come out the other end of climate crisis and various kinds of environmental crisis. But in both cases, like in the Heinlein case, you have to maybe sort of forgive him because the environmental movement is still very nascent. And I mean, interestingly, will kind of emerge alongside the anti-nuclear movement, which he was actually part of, right? One of his kind of weird, interesting political details is that Heinlein was very much like an activist against nuclear weapons, right? And you kind of see hints of that within the novel itself. But in both cases, like these novels work in part because a certain kind of ecological crisis is just bracketed off, right? It's just like sort of put on the shelf as being resolved or not being an issue, which means you get infinite expansion, right? You get like, there's always more room. There's always more space. There's always more we can do. And I do wonder if that's not like a limit in both of these novels because there's a certain kind of experience of wrestling with constraint that's just not really there. And there's a moment in sort of Marx's Capital where he talks about like, it's a footnote, I think, and it's like where he talks about freedom as being born out of the management of necessity, right? Like, you know, like freedom is that thing that sort of emerges with wrestling with constraints. And I think that's a kind of like aspect of these novels that maybe gets kind of muted a little bit.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting thing that one of the things kind of historically that I always forget about until I run into it in Heinlein and other science fiction from the 50s, 60s, 70s is like Malthusian fears, right? You know, his vision of being on the planet and people just kind of like stacked in the streets from overpopulation, and the moon is a vision out of that is that's such a strangely present fear there, and I don't think it's something that we fear very much today, and it's something that in the Terraformers, I actually think it's really interesting that it goes out of its way to sort of like name how many people, and it's thinking about carrying capacity, and it's a much smaller overall population. I think even at the end, there's only millions of people, not billions of people, right?
Which is tricky though, because the whole Malthusian kind of like worry about carrying capacity of the Earth and the whole spaceship Earth question that emerges in the 70s, like, you know, it can really easily and really quickly dovetail with like neo-fascist population control, sterilization.
It takes like half a second to slide into that.
I know, right. Exactly. And so it like that always, it makes me a little nervous on the one hand. On the other hand, like we have to be able to talk about these, like the questions of the conditions through in which humans and like other kinds of species can live. And the question of like, is there such thing as overpopulation, which is a real question.
Right.
Does overpopulation actually, what is that a meaningful term for, right? Like, does that have to be relative to food production? Does that have to be but then is the food production itself relative to the social system and so on and so forth, you know?
Yeah. I know one of the books I've been talking with another critic is Stand on Zanzibar, you know, the Brunner novel that's about it. And like, how to even talk about that novel without, you kind of have to grapple with this, like, very easily fascist, very easily eugenic, just premise. But at the same time, I feel like there needs to be a conversation about it because, like, I also think it's probably not. I shouldn't say it's not uncontroversial, but I think it would be fairly easy to lay out that, like, probably we're beyond the carrying capacity of the planet, at least for a certain level of lifestyle, right? Especially if we start according rights to non-human beings, right? Like, we're probably past the carrying point of both mountain gorillas and humans, the way we're running things right now at any rate.
Well, this is, you know, one of the most interesting arguments in kind of, to me, in left politics that's interested in economics and the like, which is somewhere, you know, kind of like a lot of my interest for my research, is this argument between like a kind of like Promethean or like kind of modernist version of responding to environmental crisis, including from like leftists and socialists and whatnot. And on the other hand, what I think is really kind of like picking up steam at the moment, maybe not the right metaphor, which is the degrowth movement, right? There's this pretty famous Japanese economist and political theorist, Kohei Seto, who wrote this book called The Degrowth Manifesto, as well as, books on Marx and Marxism and socialism and whatnot, eco-socialism. But there has been this kind of movement to think about, like, what would it mean to think about social formations that aren't premised on economic growth, right? Like that, and I think that's an interesting way to look at it, right? Because then you're not talking necessarily about population control. What you're talking about is like our socioeconomic relationships and what it means.
Not the overall size, but the patterns.
I think it's a great way of putting it. Like the patterns, right? Like the lifestyle, the kinds of lives we live, and whether or not we can continue to live these kinds of lives with big carbon imprints, like industrialized agricultural and meat consumption still rapidly spreading across the globe. Right.
Yeah. It is interesting the way both of these kind of duck that in different ways. I need to wrap this up a little bit. And one thing I was thinking about, I always try to think about a little bit how these relate to science fiction going on today. And I'm pretty sure The Terraformers is the newest book we've discussed here by a long shot. Something interesting to think about that compared to a book almost 60 years earlier is I think, I don't know how much everyone would agree with this, but I think at some point we went through an inflection point with science fiction set in space about things like terraforming, where I think when Heinlein is writing this, even if the specifics might be up for debate, the idea that we can and could and should actually colonize the moon was probably something that most people would accept, and most people in the science fiction community would accept. Whereas today, and like we talked about this a lot in the Aurora episode, I think there is pretty good reasons to like utterly doubt that, right? To utterly doubt that we will even terraform Mars. Like there's probably just too many hurdles that are not fun or sexy or even that like engaging on the page to think about. But when you start adding up the practical and engineering and radiation and sociological challenges and funding challenges and all these realities together, that these are just insurmountable problems. And I think I don't know if Newitz would personally agree with the idea that like we won't terraform other planets. I don't know. But I think they are writing on the other side of that inflection point and more aware that this is a kind of fantasy, right? And more aware that like this is more of just a thought experiment of a thing we won't actually do. And I think that gives room for some of the zaniness that we've talked about and some of the the willingness to put a rent crisis and a homelessness epidemic in a planet that has very intentionally like avoided having earthquakes. And it's like, oh yeah, you're talking about Bay Area problems. Like, okay, cool. Like I get it. Like I see what you're doing. And maybe I don't know, maybe moving past that, and we're not totally past, but maybe moving past that idea that colonizing space is a realistic goal kind of puts science fiction about it in kind of a different category.
I wonder if I'm not sure if I would like quite imagine it that chronologically. I wonder if it's almost like competing impulses that are kind of coextensive or like just kind of go along in the history of science fiction. And I think you're right that like the one that says, hey, we might never terraform. We might never colonize other planets. It might just, either the human species might go extinct before that. The energy costs might simply be too high at a certain level, especially when we're dealing with ecological crisis. And I feel like that tendency, like you see a sort of like back and forth between those tendencies, right? Because I think you're right that the Newitz has a kind of fantastic element where you're like, well, whether or not terraforming actually is functional is kind of besides the point here, in a way that it like probably wouldn't be with Robinson. But it's interesting because Robinson's kind of dialed back that sort of aspect of his own fiction, right?
Right.
Novels like Ministry for the Future or New York 2140 or things like that are much less, about terraforming, even if they do have geoengineering in them. But I do think there is something, we certainly since the early 2000s in particular, I would say, or starting in the maybe mid-2000s, there's become, and I think this is a good thing, a kind of like anti-colonial consensus in a lot of science fiction, right? It's not to say there weren't anti-colonial science fictions going back to what is it, the Le Guin forest novel, the anti-Vietnam novel, the word for world is forest, right? There's always been those kind of anti-colonial moments, but I think that's now like our consensus for science fiction in a lot of respects, which isn't to say you don't get exceptions. But even like a kind of mainstream, very mainstream science fiction series like The Expanse, right? It's going to have a kind of like positive, like anti or decolonial representation in the form of the Belters. Complicated, but nonetheless.
Right, yeah.
And so it's interesting. And then you see like Nuance's engagements with like Indigenous folks and Indigenous studies and consulting Indigenous folks about sort of some of the kind of trickier aspects of the novel when it comes to who's Indigenous. Are the Homo Archaeans Indigenous? I guess they're the earliest people, so they're sort of represented as Indigenous folks within it. But so I think it's a complicated matter because I think you're right. Like, there's no guarantee we'll ever terraform any place. If we terraform any place, you know, it might be more or less successful versions of engineering the Earth, I think is probably the most likely thing in the midterm future, I guess.
Yeah, 100%. It's something I think about in how science fiction as a genre, and we've talked about how maybe as a genre, I do think like there's some kind of inflection point going on with it, some kind of change in sort of its locus of audience and the things it's doing and how it's doing it. But I think as some of its most common features become more and more obviously a fantasy or impractical, but we still keep writing those stories in that kind of setting, I feel like something kind of changes. And that anti-colonial bent, I think, is really interesting. And I think maybe the biggest thing is that the more and more people and writers realizing that, you know, the frontier mythos is bad stuff, like toxic, right? And it's deep in Western culture. It's deep in American self-image. And it was always false. And it always relied on going to a place you could already live where other people were already living, right? And killing them and stealing their stuff and their labor. And that's not on the moon. It's not on Mars. It's not going to be in the next solar system over. And so realizing that sort of like jettisoning that fantasy is important.
We're in our Deep Space Nine moment, right? Like, you know, we're in our moment where we are trying to have a kind of ongoing reckoning with the fact that like all those beautiful science fiction fantasies we had were premised on like zeroing out not only encounters with other life, but just other material realities that we just didn't want to acknowledge. Before
we get going, is there anything you want to share with folks about anything you're working on or where people can find you? Any way you want them to look you up?
Oh, sure. So I'm mostly in a kind of like backseat these days as a kind of like editor at large, but I highly recommend folks check out Gamers with Glasses. My buddies Nate Schmidt and Don Everhart are doing amazing work there, really focusing on like indie digital games and tabletop games. You know, they wrote a great piece on like anti-fascist video games or like the need for like anti-fascist movement with the video games that I would highly recommend folks check out. And then for me, I just like say check out. I've got some reviews coming out in Ancillary. I think I'm reviewing Ray Naylor's new novel for Ancillary, which I'm actually reading it again right now. The new novel, it's great. So I'm excited about that. I've got reviews coming out of Strange Horizons, so I guess keep an eye out for reviews of what am I reviewing for them? I can't even remember. I should remember, but I don't.
If they're out by the time this episode comes out, I'll put the links in. So
yeah. So other than that, I'm just like trying to get through the semester.
Well, thanks so much for taking the time to suggest this pairing. This was, you know, I've kind of talked a lot of smack about both these books, but this was a very productive, fruitful read to put them next to each other.
Yeah.
And especially, like, I think as you pointed out that, like, Nuance being someone that, like, I'm generally pretty sure that I agree with, like, the vast bulk of their politics, and it's putting that alongside, like, Heinlein, who I'm pretty sure I don't, but thinking them of in this, like, 6-decade cycle of how science fiction talks about this stuff. It was very cool. Awesome. Thanks so much. I will catch you around.
Yeah, thank you.
A Meal of Thorns is a podcast from the Ancillary Review of Books, an online magazine founded to address the radical possibilities of criticism, with a focus on speculative fiction, world literature, and utopian impulses. Go to ancillaryreviewofbooks.org for regular reviews, essays, interviews, and more. Our opening poem is by Barcha Hari, translated by John Bruff. Our music is by Giselle Gabriel Garcia. Our artwork is by Rob Patterson at The Ratio Farm. If you'd like to support the podcast and the Ancillary Review of Books, that is very cool of you. Go to patreon.com/ancillary-review to become a backer. Come hang out with us on Discord. If you heard us talk about a book and you want to buy that book, check out our show notes for a bookshop link. We get a cut. Finally, you know the drill. Leaving a review or a rating really helps wherever you listen to us. Sharing our posts on your favorite social media really helps. Telling someone out on the street that you should check us out. I don't know if that'll help or not. It might if they like speculative fiction. Questions, suggestions, pedantic notes about things we got wrong? Drop us an email at mealofthorns@gmail.com. Pretty psyched about our upcoming schedule. Next time, I'm joined by podcaster extraordinaire Sean McTiernan of SF Ultra to talk about Gary J. Shipley's Dreams of Amputation. If you want to read ahead, please check out our website for upcoming titles. We've got some good ones on there. And I've got a good handful of probably overambitious episodes scheduled for the summer. Look out for those. Until then, read critically, read carefully, and, I guess, workshop your catchphrases.